Teddy, do you mind if we have a quick conversation about boundaries? You are not supposed to sit there. This is a table. This is not for sitting. This is for working. You understand? No? Okay. Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Sarah and I make videos about health and fitness and all of those things, endurance sports. So if that's your jam, go down below, hit the buttons, and then buckle up because you're in for a fun ride. I don't know what that means. I knew that was stupid before I even said it. Please don't leave, I promise it gets better. I'm just an idiot sometimes. But today I want to talk about the overload principle, and this is going to be especially important for those of you out there that feel like you might be plateauing or even seeing some declines in your performance. You're not seeing the return on investment for the time you're putting in for training, you're doing the hard work, and you're just not seeing the results. And very often when people get into this state of affairs in their training, they start to attribute this to some of the wrong things. One thing that people commonly attribute this to is getting older, right? Well, I guess we just slow down as we age, right? I'm not getting any younger, so maybe my age is a limiting factor for me. And more often than not, that's actually not the case. Yes, there's some truth to as you get older as an athlete, it limits your high end, right? You start to see less of those peak power values, but it really doesn't mean that you need to slow down as an athlete. There's a lot of science to prove otherwise. In fact, most of the science that initially pointed people in the direction of seeing a decline with age was more related to people just getting more sedentary with age. But if that's not the case for you, if you're putting in the time and the work and you're working hard, age is probably not a limiter for you. The next thing is, well, maybe I'm just approaching my genetic potential. And I'm going to be pretty honest with you. Most of us, if we're not pro athletes, are not anywhere near our genetic potential. And that's not a shot against anybody. That's just the reality of having jobs and having families, right? We have to prioritize other things. To reach your genetic potential, you really need to focus around sport, right? Make this a full-time endeavor. Most of us aren't getting paid to do this, and we can't necessarily make the sacrifices that we need to reach our genetic potential. So thinking that you have and that you just can't get any better, it's usually not the limiter. What's limiting most people and causing most people to plateau or even decline in their performance is not age or genetic potential. It comes down to the overload principle and how you're managing your training. There are a couple of common mistakes that people make in their training. It doesn't matter how experienced you are or even if you understand this stuff. We all fall into the same trappings that cause us to not get what we want out of our training. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to visualize the overload principle for you by kind of drawing out some graphs or visual representations that will help you to understand what's going on. This isn't going to be super scientific. There's no raw values here. It just helps you to understand what your body is doing physiologically when you train and why you might not be seeing the gains that you want to and what you might be able to do to move in the right direction. So I'm going to start by drawing a line down the center here, call it an x-axis if you will, and this line is going to represent your baseline capacity. So your muscular endurance, your FTP, your fitness, your zones, all of those things that have been baked into your bodily ability to perform based on your history and training, your genetics, all of those things combined, right? This is where you are right now, whatever that might be. This does not represent a single metric. This isn't just FTP. This is all of your energy zones. You can make a separate one of these for all of your energy zones if that makes it make more sense to you. But this is what you are currently capable of. Now, I'm going to play around with some colors here to make this a little bit easier to read as I move. But up here, you're getting better, right? Okay, so if your line goes up, you're getting better. And down here, you're getting worse, right? We don't want to get worse. But it's going to help you visualize in a moment with some of these curves that I'm going to demonstrate how your body is reacting to training. When we talk about things like functional overreaching, when you are training in a well-periodized plan and you are being productive in your workouts, this is what's happening here. I'm going to draw a little bit of a curve. Now, what does this curve represent? So you're putting load into the system. This can be done with a single workout. This can be done with a microcycle, a mesocycle. This is just representing load that you're putting into the system. But why am I showing you getting worse when you do this? Well, this is representing the damage you are doing to yourself. And you can think about this in terms of a single workout. Let's say you are going to do some VO2 max repetitions. As you get further through your workout, if those are challenging and actually in your VO2 max level zone, you do get worse. Right? You're putting damage and fatigue into the system. It's not really comfortable, and your performance over time gets worse. This is what happens in all of those different cycles. But as you recover, your body comes back to this baseline. And if you put enough load into the system, the body says, I don't really like this. I need to adapt to this. If this is going to come more and more often, I need to super compensate. And then it creates a new baseline for you, right? This is what happens when you push yourself a little bit beyond your current capacity so that your body has to make the adaptations, and then you recover here, right? You allow the recovery, whether that's full rest or periodization with less intensity, whatever that might be, and then your ability comes up here, and that becomes your new baseline. That is functional overreaching. This is where you want to live. This is how you want your training to be cycled. Now, again, not a single metric. This doesn't necessarily mean that your FTP goes up, but this might be in your VO2 max zone. This might be your aerobic zone, right? It just depends on what type of energy systems that you are using. Most of them need to be worked on individually within workouts and over time and periodizing your training, but this is the type of format that you want to follow when you set up your training plans. But the mistakes that people make that cause them to maybe not get the results that they wish are a few. So this is the first one, and this is very common for folks who are a little bit newer. So you see that the delta between their baseline and their load is a little bit less. And basically what happens is that people continue to work within a window where the body doesn't feel the need to super compensate or adapt, right? You might be a little bit above that current state ability or what's comfortable that you can just kind of knock out all day, but you really don't force the body to adapt in any way. And this happens in a couple of permutations. The first one is, we talk about that dreaded, tempo, that zone 3 or zone 2 in a 3-zone model, the Steven-Seiler hypothesis there. When people are new, they just ride a ton, and they see these huge gains by riding consistently, right? That's really what you should do when you're in your first, 6 months or so of cycling. Just put the miles in the legs, get the heart used to doing some work, get used to the breathing, or let your body adapt. But you're going to see huge gains just by being consistent. But after a while, that stops working, right? Just kind of working in that zone 3 all the time, you're going to get to the point where the body's just going to continue to come back to that baseline. Okay, you're pretty acclimated to it. Yes, you're working hard, your heart rate's up, but it's really not forcing the body to adapt or do anything to get any better because it's comfortable within that little bit of damage that it has to do and repair with some recovery. The other thing that might happen is you might be doing some harder workouts, right? Maybe you're doing some VO2 max workouts every single week or anaerobic workouts every week. But as your body adapts to those different zones, as you become more proficient in things like your VO2 max or anaerobic zone, that still could be too little stimulus to cause your body to adapt. Right? So the body's comfortable doing that, it repairs itself, and all's good in the world, but you don't ever get any better. So what can you do to fix those things? You need to increase the stimulus. You need to make the delta between your current state and the load you're putting in, the damage that you're putting into your muscles, a little bit more. You can do that by increasing the intensity. If you're doing interval workouts, maybe you take that percentage above FTP and you increase it by a couple of percentage points. You could increase the length of your intervals. You can decrease the length of your recovery. You increase the number of intervals, or if you're working in that aerobic zone, you increase the length of your workouts, or you move to a higher percentage. So if you're working at 60% of your FTP, you start working at 70% or 75% at that higher level for longer. That's how you put more load that your body is not necessarily acclimated to and it's forced to overcompensate or supercompensate for. So those who are probably in their first 3 years of cycling, this is where they might start to see some plateaus. That being said, you are never going to see the same gains that you do when you're brand new. So don't start to expect that you have 20% gains month over month after you've started to acclimate to just having some decent aerobic fitness. But that's mistake number 1. Change my color here. And we will go to mistake number 2. Let's say you do have the appropriate load into the system, right? You're down here with this green line, but what happened here? You're coming back to that baseline again. Well, we said that this represented here the curve of recovery. So what happens is you might have the appropriate load in here, but you're not giving your body the opportunity to recover. The body only has so much capacity to repair damage, right? So if you are interrupting that recovery with any number of things by introducing too much additional training too fast, or too high intensity in training or too fast, not giving yourself enough sleep or good nutrition, you slow down that ramp rate of recovery, and it doesn't allow the body to do that super compensation yet again. So your workouts might be the appropriate load, but you're not looking at the most important piece, which is recovery. All the training scientists, all the coaches out there, they may disagree on methodologies, but they all converge on one major element: recovery. That's where you make all the adaptations. So you do not want to sacrifice on recovery. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to put your feet up and rest. It might mean that in some cases, but not focusing on recovery, it can inhibit those adaptations that you want to make over time. So focus on your recovery. It's very important. So we'll change our color here again, and we're going to look at the most egregious case. And this is where a lot of people live, mind you. And this is new folks, and this is experienced folks. I see this all the time. I've been trapped in this myself as well. Pros do this. This is not something any of us are immune to, but being aware of it can help you kind of pump the brakes on that type of activity and repair it, rectify it, and start moving in the right direction. So here, you are going all the way down here, and look at what happens to your ability. You're putting too much load into the system. Whether that's a single workout, whether that's a week of working out, whatever that might be, you're putting way too much load into the system. The body has only so much capacity to repair the damage you are putting into the system. Think about things like injuries, right? Injuries, we love to have them all repair themselves overnight, but the more severe the injury, the longer it takes to repair. And especially those people who continue to add load, to add insult to injury, without pun being intended, they not only inhibit the ability to recover in a timely manner, but they can move backwards because they've done so much damage to their muscles that they're not able to come back to that current state of fitness that they had before they put too much load into the system. And right now is actually a really good time to witness some of this in the pros. So if you're watching the Tour de France right now, they're doing a lot of replays on the Olympic trials and the World Championships in advance of the Olympics on the 23rd. And you'll hear a lot of folks talking about, hey, this person put in a huge effort to do this, 5 days ago. They just broke the world record last week, and that might inhibit their performance today because they've put too much damage in the system and they can't recover, so that their new current state capacity is lower than it was last week because you're taking on too much load. Now, there is certainly a time and a place for that, right? You may have to plan for things like this throughout your season, right? If you're planning for an A race, if you're going to the Olympics, this is the time to take that giant chunk out of your capacity because you're leaving it all on the table for an important competition. That makes sense. But when people get stuck in this cycle just for training purposes, this could have very damaging effects. Now, this big red line here, it looks scary, it seems hopeless, but if you periodize things properly and you take your events into consideration, what typically happens if you're planning for competition is that you may end up seeing something a little bit more like this, right? This is where marathoners live. So they take this big dump out of the system. That sounded pretty gross, but they really do a lot of damage to the system. But they are, with some intelligent periodization, able to come back up to that baseline with a week of rest and then reintroducing some load. The body does remember this, so if you're gentle with it and you allow it to recover, you certainly can do that. What you don't want to see is this red line becoming a cyclical element of your training. This is really dangerous for a lot of folks. I'm looking at those of you out there who think it's going to be good for your fitness and performance to get on Zwift every day and turn yourself inside out for a race. that's not making you any better. And this red line is really sneaky. It doesn't hit you overnight. It doesn't even hit you in a week. You start to dig yourself a hole, and then you look a month later on, you start to compare values, losing a couple watts at a time on the bike, or you losing a couple seconds per mile on your running pace or on your swimming pace. You don't necessarily notice that this week or next week. You notice it in a month where it's just like, what the heck is going on? I'm training hard every day and I'm not putting out the same kind of power I was a month ago. It's because the body can't possibly repair from the load that you're putting into it. And it's not just you, it's not just me. As I said, the pros can suffer from this as well, even outside of competition. Lionel Sanders is a great example of this. There is nobody who can suffer like Lionel Sanders does. And he has his workouts and some of his race reports down on YouTube for the past several years. In years past, he has fallen into this trap. You can shift from this green line to this red line really easily, right? You just start to push yourself that little bit further and that little bit further, and you're feeling okay in your workouts, right? And if you've trained yourself to suffer, it's easy to kind of pull that extra 5% and 10% out of yourself. But you're really digging yourself further into this kind of damage bin here. And then when it comes time for execution, when he would go out and race, he didn't have that extra 5 or 10% to dig for anymore. He thought he could dig even deeper because of the competition element, but it wasn't there. He had put so much damage into his system that he was not able to perform at his capability level. What he knew, the paces he knew he was capable of, the power he knew he was capable of, he couldn't do it because he followed this red line a lot. And he admitted to that, and he had to make some changes when it came to overtraining, because that's really what got in his way in terms of being competitive several years ago. He's had some issues with nutrition recently, right? He's very forthcoming about that, but he has gotten a lot more healthy getting a coach and trying to avoid this red line when it comes to his training. Now, looking at all my scribbles here, they're not to scale, right? The distances between all of these deltas between your baseline and the load you're putting in the system, these are just me scribbling on a whiteboard here. But there is a point between the green and the red line where you want to kind of flirt between those two, right? You want to maybe at certain points during the season go right on that hairy edge without jumping over. And you might not know specifically where that is, but that's where things like maybe a training camp, right? Or a week of high volume on your runs, right? Maybe you do that once periodically and you kind of flirt right in between here, but still look for that super compensation. And you usually do that by introducing a little bit of extra rest after the fact. So if you do a 5-day training camp on the bike and maybe you're putting a ton of miles in, but make sure that you give your body the opportunity now to kind of dig yourself out of that hole, you can still manage those super compensations, right? These are on a spectrum, but a lot of folks live on this red line. It's just go all out all the time, and they wonder why they're not improving. It's because you're not giving the body the opportunity to repair the damage that you're doing to the muscles. So if you find that you are either moving backwards or plateauing in your training, take an honest look at what you're doing and see if you're making one of these kind of big 3 errors, right? First one being not putting enough stimulus into the system or not varying the system throughout the course of the year. There's a lot of debate between, is it sweet spot? Is it polarized? Is it HIIT training? Sometimes you have to cycle those things, right? There's periods of the year where you might have to do 4 to 6 weeks of sweet spot, and then you're doing 8 to 12 weeks of polarized, and then you move into a sharpening phase with HIIT training, right? You're changing the stimulus and you're adding more load or different load into the system, working different energy systems that's going to move you from this blue line to this green line. The second mistake is shortchanging your recovery. We've all done this before. It is really the Achilles heel of most athletes. Don't shortchange your recovery because maybe you feel like you're missing out on some opportunity to train, but if you haven't built yourself up to a particular level and you're adding too much load into the system too soon, you're not going to get that super adaptation. More is not always better. If it's at the expense of your recovery, you're better off recovering and letting the body adapt because of that super compensation mechanism, which is going to elicit improvements in your energy systems. And the third thing is, are you doing too much? Again, more is not always better. People think that they need to make these big hero leaps in their training, right? If you're at 4 hours, well, 8 hours must be better. Great, 8 hours probably is better, but it doesn't mean you're going to jump from 4 to 8 hours and see good results. You're going to set yourself backwards. Usually a good rule of thumb is increasing 10% to 15% week over week, right? You'll get there, but you're not going to be able to offset 5 or 10 years of not being active in a month. You're not going to be able to offset some injury in a week, right? You have to be patient. You have to add the load intelligently enough that, again, you're letting the body adapt and you're not digging yourself such a hole that you're going to move backwards. So I hope that this stuff is helpful for you. I know that this isn't particularly pretty. This isn't particularly scientific here. I just hope that visualizing this will make it a little bit easy for you to recognize in your own training where those pitfalls are and realize that you're not stuck where you are. You're not doomed to move backwards because you're getting older. You're not doomed to plateauing because this is what you're genetically limited to doing. Take a look at your training, whether you are looking at a periodized plan that you bought, something that you built. If you have the ability to work with a coach, coaches are always a good kind of sense check apparatus for most people. A lot of good coaches that still compete, they have their own coaches because they have their own blind spots on, right? This is why the pros get coaches, because sometimes you need somebody to smack you on the hand and say, hey, get out of that red zone, buddy. You got to take a day off. You got to stop doing that. You can't push yourself indefinitely. If you can't afford a coach, though, giving yourself a nice sense check periodically throughout your training, just taking a look, maybe sitting down each month and evaluate what your plan was, what you're doing, how your fitness is looking, how you're feeling, how you're performing. If you do that evaluation once per month, you'll probably recognize some things and be able to move forward. So if you thought that this was helpful, if you wouldn't mind giving the video a thumbs up, it really does help the channel and the video quite a bit. Subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down below. And as always, I will catch you in the next one. See ya.